Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Today it's a little bit smoky out here in Colorado because of all the fires going around. Speaking of which, I'm going to show you something else that was on fire at one point. This. Now, to the untrained eye, this may appear nothing more than a burnt stray piece of driftwood. However, this is something very different, and it has a far more clandestine and sinister story behind it. This, believe it or not, is a stalk from a Mosin Nagant. This particular stalk was dug up from a river in Belgium, of all places. In a river near Zonnebeek, which is right next to the Ypres, the town of Ypres, the Ypres battlefield. So this poses a lot of interesting questions right off of the bat. And a lot of you already have a good question, which is, why was a Mosin Nagant in Belgium? Well, this is actually a really good question. And to really understand this, we have to go back to March of 1918, during World War I. And in March, there was a treaty by the name of Brest-Litovsk, and this treaty was between the German Empire and Russia. And basically what it did was bring Russia out of World War I by giving up Germany large swaths of territory. And it was one of the greatest shames in the history of Russia, because essentially what it did was nullify the sacrifices of millions of lives from the side of Russia. And, from so many different countries fought for Russia during World War I. And when the communists took over, they wanted out of the war, and they fought through all of that, and millions of lives lost for absolutely nothing. One of the greatest travesties in modern history, in my opinion. But the Russian Revolution and what kind of happened as a result of that is a topic for another video. But we're in March of 1918, and one of the great things for the German Empire about the signing of the Treaty at Brest-Litovsk was that the Russian Empire was now, the Russian Empire in its current form didn't exist anymore, but Russia as a whole entity was no longer fighting against the Germans in World War I. And really what it did was eliminated the entire Eastern Front of the war, more or less. And what it really did was allow all those troops and arms and munitions and resources to go towards the Western Front. Okay? So if you're Germany, you got exactly what you wanted and then some in March of 1918. And at this point in history, it was looking really good for the Germans. It was looking like, wow, the Russians are out of the war. And the Russians were really the big powerhouse the entire time from 1914 onward. Now, they had their ups and downs, but from a sheer manpower perspective, they basically had a comparatively endless supply of men that they could send to the front. So the fact that that was just gone and the Germans didn't have to worry about that was fantastic for them. They were able to fully dedicate the war efforts to the Western Front. So we go a month in advance now to April of 1918. And we go to the town of Ypres. Now, there's been battles going on here for years now. And what we have is actually a salient. It's called the Ypres Salient. Simply put, a salient is a bulge. It is something that is protruding out. And here in this picture, we can see the bulge around the town of Ypres protruding from the rest of the front lines of the Western Front. This picture indicates the German offensive during the spring of 1917. At the top right of the picture, near the town of Ypres, is roughly the area where this stock would have been recovered. So this picture really gives you a good idea of where Zonnebeek is, where this was recovered. So I'm going to pause here and we're going to talk about how this horrible atrocity made it to Colorado in the United States. Well, there's a great website called Relics of the Front. It's based out of the United Kingdom, and they sell tons and tons of different relics dug up from different parts of the world. It could be from Belgium, the Ukraine, just all over Europe. And I'm really impressed by them because they were actually able to correctly identify this as a Mosin Nagant stock. I think 99 out of 100 people would just look at this and either not care because it looks so horrible or just not really know exactly what it is. The fact that they were able to correctly assess this as being a Mosin Nagant stock is absolutely fabulous. So I'm going to post a link to their website below. I would ask that you just at least have a look at what they have. Maybe you'll find something of interest. But it's a fantastic website, and it was a pleasure doing business with them. Let's take a closer look now at this stock, because it has some really interesting features, and I'm going to show you how exactly we can tell that it is, in fact, a Mosin Nagant stock. Alright, so we're starting at the back here, and straight off we can see this big old crack. And this is actually kind of synonymous with a lot of wrist cracks. This would be what we would refer to as the wrist area, because you would have your hand right here. We actually see this on Mosin Nagants that weren't burned and found in a river, which is thankfully most of them. So we kind of have to wonder what happened here. Now, we don't exactly know if this particular damage occurred when all of the rest of the damage did, but it does look pretty bad. What we can infer just from physics, what happens here is the receiver actually comes slamming back into the stock itself, and there's enough of that impact where it can jar it enough to actually send a massive crack through the entire rear of the stock. And that's what we see here. So likely what the best guess of what happened is when this either exploded or what have you, it sent the receiver flying somewhere at a very high speed. And it looks like the screw, which is actually still intact, right here, looks like the head is missing. Now the head would be on top, right? And the head would be above the actual receiver and would essentially be clamping it to the stock. So the fact that that's gone kind of tells me that it was forcibly removed very violently, very quickly, and very aggressively from the stock itself, which could have been what caused this cracking back here. Now we look here on the side, and we see this interesting debris here. This looks like it was caused by water, which makes sense because they told me that this was found in a river. And we kind of see the same thing here as we go towards the front of the stock here, right? We see more of the same thing. All right. And here we can, if we look under, we can see the remnants of that rear action screw. Something absolutely horrible happened to this gun. Okay. So here's the other side of the stock. Here we can see this is the bolt it's actually it's a bolt for the lug. There's this metal lug here, and it's a reinforcement for the stock because the receiver has a protrusion that sits down in here. Here's our other screw. We can see it's still here. And this metal bar that goes back here just basically gives the receiver a surface to touch, so that the force of, you know, shooting the rifle hits against that metal instead of enacting all that force directly to the wood itself, which would of course cause more cracking. This is the nut here. This is actually a metal piece, and the cleaning rod actually, right, it goes down in the stock, and the cleaning rod on the underside of the stock will actually screw into this metal nut here. It's interesting that that's still here. This wood is relatively well preserved, I must say, for being over 100 years old in such horrible condition. It does appear that this was in a low oxygen environment. When you have low oxygen, you can find wood can survive for a very long time. I mean, there's thousands and thousands year old pieces of wood people find in bogs and in, you know, Europe and things like that. So the fact that it was in a river was probably a good thing, because if it wasn't in a river, it probably either never would have been found or would have been in even worse shape. Yeah, I know, like, that's even possible, right? But it really is. Okay, also worth noting here, let me zoom out, you see this little cutout here? So that one is going to be for your interrupter. Now, if you're not familiar with the Mosin Nagant interrupter, go check out our previous video on that. It's actually a really great feature of the Mosin Nagant, and it prevents issues like rim lock. So it's really cool. We can still see features like that on the stock. So we're going to turn it over now, and I'm going to show you how we know this is a Mosin Nagant stock. Okay, so let's look at the bottom here. Okay, so we can kind of see, might need to flip it over again. Be careful with it, it is pretty delicate. Okay. So here's the bottom, we can see the outline of the magazine well. There's our front action screw right there. Again, you look at this, and I'm so impressed that they were able to identify, oh, this is a Mosin Nagant stock. What I have here to show you is a Mosin Nagant magazine. Now, this probably would have been one just like what was in this gun. This has the old style sling swivel on the magazine itself. So what I'm going to do is try to fit this now into what's left of the stock. Alright, so I'm going to sit it here. So we see what's left of that screw lines up perfectly, and that rear one lines up perfectly because it screws into the bottom of the magazine here. So this is in fact a Mosin Nagant stock. Look at that, guys. That is crazy. Okay, so we've been able to identify this as a Mosin Nagant stock dug up from somewhere around the Ypres battlefield, which was most likely around 1918. So why do we think it was 1918? Well, this goes back to that German offensive we were talking about in April. But we still haven't addressed the question. What does a Mosin Nagant have to do with Germany? And that's a very good question. Well, the reason we were talking about the treaty at Brest-Litovsk earlier is because all of those resources that were freed from the Eastern Front that moved over to the Western Front, this guy probably was in that whole batch of train loads of stuff heading over to Belgium. Why is that? Well, you see, over the course of the war, there was actually tons of Mosin Nagants captured by the Central Powers, especially the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as the German Empire. And in the case of the latter here, the Germans actually made some interesting uses of the Mosin Nagant. They would actually put them on boats, and they would actually use them as they would basically shoot at surface mines on the water with Mosin Nagants. Originally they were doing that with machine guns, but after they became really resource constrained over the course of the war, they actually replaced those with the Mosin Nagant. And that makes a lot of sense from a logistics standpoint, right? Because a machine gun is an extremely crucial tool on the front lines of the war. So the more you can send them there, the better. And if you can replace them in places they don't really need to be, like, you know, on a patrol boat and you're shooting at surface mines on the water, well, this is going to do just as good, right? So I think that was a pretty wise decision on their part. They would also convert a lot of these into 8mm Mauser. And most of those guns actually ended up in Turkey. They were pretty dubious, I think, at best, because they actually had to drastically cut back the barrel shanks to be rechambered, because they had to recut the entire chamber for a larger caliber. It was a really sketchy idea, so most of those ended up in Turkey. The fact, though, that a Mosin Nagant ended up on the front lines, though, of the war really tells us a lot about how desperate the German Empire must have been in the spring offensive of 1918. They were literally giving it all they had. Was this really all they had, though? Well, we don't know. But it's interesting because this is really the first good, tangible proof I've seen of a Mosin Nagant used by the Central Powers on the Western Front during World War I. And as horrible as this thing is, it's a great analogy of just how desperate both sides really were to finally put an end to this war that had dragged on for almost 4 years at this point and sacrificed millions of lives. It was a really horrible war. It was arguably the worst war in history. World War II was pretty horrible as well. But it's something that, you know, I think public education just doesn't really do a good job of teaching the public about. World War I was so horrible, and if I could only have one object to represent how horrible World War I was, I think this is a pretty good object. It needs no words about what happened during that horrible time in human history. Well, guys, I hope you learned something. This is a really interesting piece, but we also have to remember that while this is just a piece of wood, there was a human being that used this gun and went to war with this gun. And so let us never forget what those who went before us went through, regardless of which side they were on, because it was crucial for us to get to where we are today. And I pray that we never have to go through these kinds of events again. We were very blessed to be able to watch this video from our couches instead of having to go to the front lines of Ypres in 1918 against machine guns and tanks with a Mosin Nagant. What a terrible time indeed. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know if y'all got any prayer requests, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care.